organization, our NGO, accredited at the Department of Global Communications, is called Justice for All, and we have programs that work to prevent genocide. We have programs on the Rohingya Muslims, the Uyghur Muslims, and the Muslims of India. We are largely a Muslim American organization and are proud to help lead human rights education in the Muslim community. It's certainly a huge need, and it's not only Muslim minorities that are in trouble, obviously. But the UN failure in Bosnia many years ago in peacekeeping, there was the genocide in Srebrenica. And in fact, our founder, Imam Malik Mujahid, started Bosnia Task Force at that time. There have been other failures and unfortunately other mass atrocities since then. And Burma or Myanmar is not the only place, and the Uyghur are not the only population. The previous panel centered the voices of survivors from 7 genocides, from Armenia through Rwanda and the Yazidis and so forth. It's very important, obviously, to center the voices of the impacted communities. But today, we're speaking with the experts, and perhaps some of the impacted communities will, in fact, engage during the questions and answers. But the structure of the panel discussion today will start with a brief presentation by Imam Saffet Catovic, a Bosnian Muslim imam here and a Muslim leader. And then we'll go into the panel. Imam Saffet Catovic heads the Islamic Society of North America, Washington, D.C. Office for Interfaith Community Alliances and Government Relations. He was a founding member of ISNA's Green Initiatives Committee, previously known as the Green Mosque Task Force, and also served for many years as the Muslim chaplain at Drew University. A Bosnian American, Imam Catovic is a member of the Parliament of the World's Religions Climate Action Task Force and also its Board of Trustees. Imam.
Thank you so much, Adem, and peace and blessings to you all. Salam alaikum. Coming to you today from my home in New Jersey, the traditional ancestral lands of the Lenape peoples. And so when we speak about genocide, we understand that issues of genocide do not only impact those who are outside of the United States of America, but inside of the United States of America and have a long history here as well. And so we recognize and we acknowledge that fact and that reality as we begin with land acknowledgements. It's wonderful to be with all of you. This is the last day of our Eid al-Adha celebrations within the Muslim community. It's one of our 2 major annual holidays, religious festivals, celebrating the sacrifice or commemorating the sacrifice of Abraham and Ishmael and his wife Hajar. And so Muslims engage in various ways of helping those who are in need, and those who are in need more than anyone else are the victims and the current targets of genocide here and around the world. And so I'm very thankful to the organizers of this panel and for ISNA's ability to participate with Justice for All and the United Nations organization for the Committee for Human Rights, the UN NGO Committee for Human Rights, and to be able to listen to some of our eminent experts and scholars in the field of genocide studies and in the areas of focus, and to provide us hopefully with ideas and ways in which work currently underway and maybe work that needs to be underway can lead us out of the genocide paradigm, which unfortunately is rearing its head in too many ways in too many places. I don't know if I have access to the PowerPoint or not, or someone else, one of the technical assistants can help with that. So I did send a revised PowerPoint, and if we can share that, that would be great. If not, I'll just say my few words of introduction, and then I would like to just listen and learn from all of you. Yes, Brother Wahid said he needs to be a host or co-host. So if someone can make that happen, that's fine.
Yes, you are a co-host now.
So I'll give it a second. I don't know if were they able to select the video or not, or I should just go into the presentation, Brother Adem.
If you want to show the video first, that's also okay. Wahid has a copy of that as well.
Okay, so if he has the 2-minute video, they say a picture's worth 1,000 words and a moving picture is worth 1,000,000 words. So I think we have a 2-minute video just talking a little about Srebrenica. I'll have a very brief reflection, and then once again looking forward to learning from and understanding better from the various esteemed experts and scholars we have with us. Can you show that, Brother Wahid? If not, the PowerPoint is sufficient. He's working on it. He said, give him a minute.
All right, it would be nice to see. Or not nice. It's a very striking video, and maybe you might want to say something about your connection to the center in Bosnia.
Okay. Yeah. Well, very briefly, I myself, I'm Bosnian American. My father came to the United States as a political refugee from former Yugoslavia, as he was an anti-communist activist. And his family was amongst the many families impacted during the genocide of World War II, which we thought would be the last genocide. 8 out of 10 members of my father's immediate family, my uncles, my aunts, my grandparents, were among those killed in the ethnic cleansing of World War II. And that unfortunately repeated itself again in 1992, specifically in the villages of Plana and Jecha in the county of Bileća in the area of Herzegovina. 155 out of 225 Catovics were killed in those 2 villages in ways that repeated itself with striking similarity in the genocide that took place beginning in 1992 through 1995. So Srebrenica is the only place in Bosnia and Herzegovina, despite the fact that many areas of Bosnia and Herzegovina and many of the land is witness to genocide that had taken place on it, that the international legal system had ruled as genocide taking place. And so for Bosnian Muslims throughout the country of Bosnia and Herzegovina, it stands as a symbol, recognizing that genocide took place in many parts of emblematic of the genocide that took place across the entire nation. So I don't know if we can show the video, Brother Wahid, please show it, and then we can have a couple of minutes of presentation after that and reflection. Thank you.
11. jula 1995. godine u srpskoj Srebrenici. Uoči još jednog velikog praznika srpskoga poklanjamo srpskom narodu ovaj grad i napokon došao je trenutak da se posle bune protiv Dahija Turcima osvetimo na ovom prostoru.
This was General Ratko Mladic hours before the town of Srebrenica was overrun by Bosnian Serb forces. More than 8,000 Muslim Bosnians, mostly men and boys, were killed on July 11, 1995 under his command and wartime leader Radovan Karadzic in what is known as the Srebrenica Genocide. The UN had declared the town a safe area for civilians under the protection of Dutch peacekeepers, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and unable to face the Serb offensive. Their requests for reinforcements were reportedly denied by the UN, and thus began the worst mass killings on European soil since World War II. Unarmed Muslim men and boys as young as 12 were separated from their families for execution, while women and girls were forced to evacuate the town. Nearly 15,000 Muslims tried to flee through the woods in what was called the Death March to reach the Bosniak-controlled city of Tuzla. But along the way, thousands were killed by Serb forces. Systematic torture, abuse, and rape went on for days. Those executed were buried in mass graves around the village of Potocari, which were dug up by Serb forces shortly after the war and relocated to hide the crime. By the end of 1995, Mladic was one of Europe's most wanted war criminals and a fugitive for 15 years before finally being arrested in 2011. Known as the Butcher of Bosnia, the UN War Crimes Tribunal in 2017 found him guilty of 10 out of 11 counts of war crimes.
The crimes committed rank among the most heinous known to humankind and include genocide and extermination as a crime against humanity. The chamber sentences Mr. Ratko Mladic to life imprisonment.
And in 2019, Radovan Karadzic was also sentenced to life. 25 years later, the Srebrenica genocide is still an open wound at the heart of Europe. Body parts are still being found in more than 100 different mass graves and identified through DNA analysis. The victims are buried every year at a memorial center close to the former UN base, where most of them were last seen alive. but thousands are still considered missing. Survivors like Ramiz Nukic have been looking for the remains of the victims, including his family members, for the last 15 years.
Ja sam sebi zacrtao plan dok se ne pronađu svi ovdje da ih pronađem, da tražim.
Thank you for that sharing. I don't know if we can pull up the PowerPoint, but if not, I will just go through my brief remarks and then as a way of sort of maybe framing the conversation and the discussion, or maybe setting a foundation for it. Potocari, the location of the Srebrenica Memorial, is where space became a place where theologies, faith, history, human rights, international law, and geopolitics come together, where obligatory remembrance at the individual and collective level is felt and lived through the mutual sharing of experiences among the survivors, the living, those who witnessed the horrors of ethnic cleansing, a sanitized euphemism for genocide firsthand with those who come afterwards, and yes, with the generations yet unborn. It is a physical manifestation of an attempt of the Bosniak people, the Bosnian Muslim people, to build our collective historic memory and create a shared past and a memory for a people with a shared future and destiny. It is also a place of mental mapping of history based on real past that seeks to construct a future that is rooted and connected to the past, but not held hostage to it. Where gravestones memorialize and are monuments, soul candles, as one observer mentioned, a visual and contextual memorial to lives once lived who are now shuhada, martyrs, not those who die for a cause and the right to be free, the right to be who they are, but also stand as living moral witnesses and testimony to what we have done wrong as Bosnians, as Serbs, as Croatians, as European nations and governments of the world, as peoples of the world, both by commission and omission. So we will not do it ever, ever again. Potocari contains the four truths required for reconciliation. Forensic, the exhuming and excavating of the past. Social, we are bound together as Bosniak people in blood, soil, faith, language, and those bonds are cemented by our collective experience of ethnic cleansing and genocide from 1992 to 1995, this being the 10th genocidal campaign organized and orchestrated against the Bosniak Muslim people for over the last century and a half. And it is deeply personal, as the victims and survivors daily interact with the place of pain and suffering, and the possibility of coming face to face with the perpetrators of those who carried out the crimes, but who still live and walk the streets. The challenge remains to reconcile, but how? I hope that our conversation today will speak to and begin to unpack ways in which we can move forward. On every gravestone marker in the valley in Potocari at the Srebrenica Memorial, there is a marker, and on the marker it says, translated to English, recite Al-Fatiha. This is the opening chapter of the Holy Quran. It consists of 7 verses. It is a weighty surah and has been described by the Prophet as being that of import and weight as equivalent to half of the Quran. It is recited both as a blessing for the dead, but it is also recited by the living in our daily prayers for the practicing Muslim. A connection point for those who live in the graves and those who stand before them and remember. In summary, the word Fatiha means the opening. So while it is recited for those who have passed, it is also the possibility of an opening for the future. Genocide is in the ethics of memory. It is both thick, meaning personal and familial, and thin, meaning a human society and human community experience. We must remember so as not to forget in the face of those who would seek to cause us to forget and erase our past, deny our present, and destroy our future. But also, as we chart a way forward, it is an opening to the future for reconciliation. I thank you and I look forward to listening to our presentation today. God bless.
Thank you, Imam. And as we remember the victims at Srebrenica and also the memory of their lives, not only their victimhood, hopefully we can be feel a renewed commitment towards justice and accountability, which is one part of the work we all do. Ending genocide, preventing genocide, mitigating, it all also relates to justice and accountability, and it all goes together. As we hear from our panelists today about the link between responsibility to protect, or R2P, and genocide prevention, about where the resistance is to ending genocide, what legislation and mechanisms are in place, what about political will and multilateralism. Much more could be said these days, but instead of going on, I wanted to start introducing the panelists. And I think we'll start with Eve Zucker, because the first panel, we really left out Cambodia. And Eve's extensive work on Cambodian genocide deserves to be known. I think also Gregory Stanton, another speaker, has experience on the same genocide. But as we each person does a presentation of about 7 minutes, I hope that will leave time where we can really have discussion and also respond to questions. So quickly, Eve Zucker serves as president of the Center for Khmer Studies, is a member of the steering committee of the Yale Genocide Studies Program, and a member of the executive committee of the New York Southeast Asia Network. She teaches anthropology courses on mass violence, digital memorialization, and Southeast Asian studies at Columbia University and Yale University. Her work concerns how societies and communities recover from and remember mass violence through digital media, social memory, moral interpretation, the imagination, resilience, empathy, trust, and everyday practices. She has conducted extensive research on the aftermath of the Cambodian genocide and more recently has expanded her work to include the Holocaust. Please, Professor Zucker.
Thank you, and thank you to Justice for All for organizing this panel. It's a great honor to be here and with such distinguished guests, so thank you very much. So today I'm going to talk about some of the impacts actually of digitalization on public memory of the genocides, because as we all know, the way that genocides are remembered are are not only important for the memory of the victims, but it's also important to prevent other genocides from happening, even though there has been a call since the time of the Holocaust to not forget, and genocides have still taken place. That doesn't mean that the memory is not integral to prevention in terms of making sure something like that doesn't happen again. So those of you not familiar, I think most of you are familiar with the Cambodian genocide, but let me just say quickly that the Cambodian genocide happened primarily between 1975 and 1979 when the Khmer Rouge, a communist organization, they took the capital of Phnom Penh after first having taken most of the countryside. They actually controlled the country, much of the country before 1975. And during the time they were in power, they killed nearly around 2 million people through direct execution and also through overwork, lack of medicine, and other hardships. I'm not going to go much into the background with the Khmer Rouge here because I'd like to use my time to focus on the digital practices. So digitalization, as we know, has changed our relationship with the past. And a result of its new, very unique features, it has changed our memory of mass atrocities. So these features include, now there's a lot of them here, but they're all important. The features include the ease of access to ever increasing digital archives, the fluidity between digital formats, sites, platforms, and tools, the one-click shareability, the ubiquity of smartphones and internet access, the reproducibility allowing for endless repetition, especially with the aid of algorithms, malleability, and this is from Anthony Hoskins, the immediacy, mobility, flexibility, and interactivity that derives from digital hyperconnectivity. Digital media and tools have opened opportunities to make the history and memory of past genocides more available to young and old through a variety of new platforms, programs, tools, and other digital innovations. These new means of memorialization and education can shape and contribute to empathy and connection between children and survivors. It can also enhance social and cultural identity and support narratives that enable healing. In addition, digital media and tools have the capacity to help buffer, if not extinguish, genocide distortion and accountability. However, the features that make the past so present and available for education and prevention are equally powerful in distorting, defacing, erasing, and trivializing the past. Moreover, some digital capacities may lend themselves to re-victimizing those who perished in genocides or contributing to narratives and memes that perpetuate ongoing genocides and contribute to new ones. For Cambodia, the role of digitalization in documenting and memorializing the Cambodian genocide goes back to the mid-1990s, when the Cambodian Genocide Program at Yale created an online digital archive of 4 databases, which were originally mapping, biographic, bibliographic, and photographic, to provide information for a potential tribunal and as a resource for scholars, survivors, and the public. The CGP, as it was called, created the Documentation Center in Cambodia, which ended up playing a significant role later on in the ECCC tribunal, otherwise known as the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. Since then, a wide variety of digital projects and programs have emerged, both connected to the state and international projects, such as the ECC, but also by groups and individuals in and outside of Cambodia. Together, these have included websites, digitalized archives, such as those at the ECCC, DCCAM, the Tuol Sleng Museum of Genocide, also through blogs, social media pages, and posts, and smartphone apps that were created to educate Cambodian youth about the Khmer Rouge past. Most Cambodians these days have access to a smartphone and the internet. In order to illustrate some of the issues that have arisen with digitalization, I wish to share with you a couple of examples pertaining to the memory of the Cambodian genocide, as we will see, to other genocides as well. Each of the examples concerns the archive of photographs of prisoners that were taken by the guards at Tuol Sleng prison, which was an execution, it was a interrogation and site that led to execution in Phnom Penh, where somewhere between 16 to 20,000 people that we know of were murdered. Each of the examples concerns the archive photographs of, During the Khmer Rouge period, the intake procedure of Tuol Sleng prison included photographing the inmates upon arrival. This process involved the prisoners, when they would come in as part of the intake procedure, they would come in with a blindfold on, and then the prison photographers would remove the blindfold, tell them how they should sit or stand, photograph them then, and catalog their entry into the prison. After that, the prisoner would face torture and then execution. A collection of these black and white photos is one of the primary exhibits at the Tuol Museum of Genocide and have become emblematic of both the memory of the victims and the memory of the horrors of the Cambodian genocide. The circumstances behind the photographs and meanings are well known to anyone familiar with them. Thus, it was shocking to many when in April 2021, a week before the anniversary of the Khmer Rouge capture of Phnom Penh, the news outlet Vice circulated an article featuring a digital artist, Matt Lowry, who had altered a selection of the Tuol Sleng photos, coloring them in, and in some cases, changing the expression of the victim to a smile. Now, you remember that these people were terrified at the time. The images and story went viral on social media, and outrage mounted both in and outside of Cambodia. Several expressed gall of the artist is distortions of the past and the disrespect toward the victims. Online petitions were circulated. His alteration of the expressions of victims by making them to appear smiling provoked a particularly strong reaction. Much was said about the social media discussions about how Lowry's work was a falsification of history and that he lacked sensitivity and even morality. In response, the Cambodian government quickly issued a statement condemning the corruption of the images. The images were removed from Vice, and eventually Lowry removed them as well from his webpage and social media pages. It is noticeable that amid the social media maelstrom, in a message of support to Tuol Sleng Museum, the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Museum posted that Lowry had also tampered with Auschwitz prisoners' photographs, even going so far as to give like animation to the photograph of a young teenage prisoner. The threat to so in that, I just want to just add there for those people not familiar with it, there is digital programming that's available where you can take photographs or anything else and cause them to look like they're looking around or moving. Okay. The threat to the dignity and memory of the victims of genocide was and is clearly global in nature. Every digitized photograph in every accessible archive or online site is clearly at risk. I give one brief related example also involving the Tuol Sleng photographs that occurred around the same time. Another digital artist, this time a Canadian, was discovered to be using the images to create wall art. Her technique was to make slight alterations to the backgrounds of the photos and then to eclipse the face either with the addition of a cloud that was around the head or by simply smudging out the face and then selling it as art. As a result, so these were then created into prints, and these prints then were being sold online and in addition to well-known stores. So one of the most pernicious aspects of what was happening here was because the images, these prints, which were made, there was a multitudes of them made. They were sold to all kinds of stores, including well-known stores like Neiman Marcus, Better Homes, and so forth. Was that once you looked at those prints being sold on those sites, they would appear because of the advertising algorithms in the margins of every other site or lots of different sites you'd visit, but suddenly you'd be looking at the shopping site, looking, at, for example, the site next door or at a news article, and there would appear the print with the prisoner from Tuol Sleng. The perniciousness of the algorithm was most pronounced in the banality then of these appearances. Tuol Sleng Museum and the Cambodian government was informed, and the prints have since been removed. There is much to be said and discussed about these cases and their implications for genocide, perpetration, prevention, and memory. The alterations, the decontextualizations, defacements all serve to trivialize and distort the memory of the victim and the memory of the genocide. It can even be said that the victims whose photographs were circulating were undergoing a second type of genocide, as their images of their suffering were trivialized and even defaced as a curiosity for entertainment or for someone's decor. There are many implications from which I wish to leave for the discussion, but I just want to add that this is only the tip of the iceberg of what we are facing now. And I leave you here with just a few thoughts. We need to rein in the misuse of digital archival images while continue to make them accessible and maintaining public trust in the archives. We need to utilize digital tools to combat hate and genocide. How can we do this? Understanding how digitalization is changing how genocide is represented and how it's remembered is paramount. Questions here concern the modes of transmission between groups and sites, mutability of digital objects, use of AI and algorithms, and the role of archives, among others. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zucker. And very troubling. We all were aware of the role of technology in incitement to violence, and but it's not just Facebook. It's the role of what you just described, digitalization in shaping and distorting memory is quite chilling. So I thought I would ask Max Pensky next, and then Karen Smith, former special advisor Karen Smith, and then Gregory Stanton. So Max is co-director of the Binghamton University Institute of Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention, professor of philosophy and a prolific writer on social and political philosophy and philosophy of law and international relations. Binghamton University established the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention, also known as IGMAP, in late 2016. And I remember being at the launch, or one of the launch events in New York, working to bring all the forces of the university to bear on atrocity prevention, including research, teaching, convening, and outreach. The center's broad definition of prevention extends beyond conflict management or midstream intervention approaches and explores the full range of strategies. Professor Pensky.
Okay, thank you, Adam, very much for that introduction, and thanks to all the other speakers and the audience members. It's great to be here. I'm speaking to you from the traditional lands of the Oneida and Onondaga nations, and beyond the land acknowledgement, for those of you who have interest in law in particular and international law in general, I would encourage you to explore the fascinating use that the Onondaga Nation in particular has been making over the last 10 years of the mechanisms of international law, from the International Court of Justice all the way to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, as a way of advancing and advocating and spotlighting a long tradition, a history of oppression, domination, breaking of treaties, environmental destruction. It's one of the most ingenious and creative uses of the mechanisms and institutions of international law to put some sunlight on a long history and memory of genocide that I can think of. So I would encourage people to explore that. So I don't want to take up too much time. I just wanted to highlight one aspect of what Adam has asked us to reflect on today, which is prevention. And as Adam said, one of the things that we've learned, I think, where we work, and a lot of the colleagues that I know here would agree, is that it's so important, I think, to expand what we mean by prevention well beyond the sort of the midterm response to genocides and other atrocity crimes when they are imminent or when they have already broken out. I think that, as important as that is, and I'm going to defer all the discussion of the responsibility to protect to my friend and colleague Karen Smith, but waiting around or running from one fire to the next, as we often describe it, trying to marshal political will, operational and logistical capacity, once atrocities and including genocides have already started out, is an approach that has proven to be increasingly proven to be ineffective and costly. And a far less spectacular and a far less dramatic, but a far more important, I think, a strategy takes a very broad sense of prevention, which really focuses not just on what we often call midstream prevention, which is to say responding to imminent or ongoing atrocities, but really tries in a sort of what we would call an upstream way to build capacity and to build resilience in societies that are demonstrating what we now understand increasingly are common risk factors for atrocity crimes. And much more important, and just as important, and I think that's what the Imam and Eve have just been talking about, in a post-atrocity society, and virtually all societies are post-atrocity societies in one way or another, to try to understand the role and function of memorialization practices as part of that idea of building resilience. For the remainder of the another 4 or 5 minutes here, let me just focus attention domestically on one moment and describe for you, in that broad sense of building resilience and responding to fragility and recognized risk factors. Let me just highlight, I think, what I'm sure all of us here in the United States are finding as extremely strange days indeed in our country. And I think one of the things that makes the current atmosphere, the current landscape of atrocity prevention in the United States so odd right now, for me anyway, is the strange coincidence of two very, very different dynamics. And it's sort of a good news, bad news thing, right? And so on the one hand and the other. On the one hand, I think that with the advent of the Biden administration, the United States government in particular has been, I think, and I say this with a lot of guarded optimism, fairly energetic, especially in the executive branch, of making good on a lot of state initiatives that had really been on the back burner for several years. I'm referring to a couple of pieces of legislation and their enactment in particular. One, and I won't go into details of these, maybe it'll come up in the discussion. One is really following through with the Global Fragility Act, which was passed several years ago, but had been sort of on ice. That is an act that is really trying, I think, to really change the way that the United States government thinks about its role as a positive agent and supporter of peace-building exercises globally by really trying to rethink how government actors in general and the State Department and USAID and the United States military in particular think about localization efforts, partnering with states and non-state organizations globally in a way that's sustainable, in a way that's sensitive to local contexts, and in a way that frees local actors and grassroots organizations from the very burdensome reporting requirements that I think have really hobbled, really hobbled efforts to build sustainable and effective relationships for building political and social resilience. That's going on right now. It's under the radar, but for those of us who are wonks in this area, it's really quite exciting. The other thing that I would mention is that the day after tomorrow, on Friday morning, the United States government will launch its strategy to anticipate, prevent, and respond to atrocities. All of us in the American community are very eager to see what's in that strategy. The cynical among us think that are not expecting much more than a sort of a repackaging and representation of some of the Obama era policies. Others in the sort of the Capitol Hill watch, or the watch of the USAID in particular, are really quite intrigued by what this strategy contains and whether it will amplify, I think, some of the really exciting things that are happening on the part of the United States government in trying to get better at being a responsible partner in global efforts to address and respond to atrocity risks, rather than simply, try to impose its will unilaterally on the rest of the world. So on the one hand, in terms of addressing structural factors for fragile states. There's a lot of things going on in our country, and my country, the United States, that are really quite interesting. On the other hand, and I'll stop here, some of you might have been watching the live select committee to investigate the insurrection on January 6th that ended about 90 seconds before this meeting began. And I think, without going into it, I think what we've seen over the course of those meetings is that the United States now exhibits very serious political fragility and instability of the kind that we atrocity prevention wonks often get very worried about when we're trying to forecast the risks of atrocity crimes, particularly atrocity crimes linked to disputed elections in other countries around the world. Representative Raskin, at his closing statement to this penultimate session that just ended at 4 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, made a very lucid point, which he didn't need to spell out, which is that authoritarian governments or authoritarianism within democratic societies, for all their differences in different political contexts, different social, different cultural, linguistic contexts, almost invariably show two very consistent features. One is that they refuse to accept the outcome of democratic elections if they lose. And the other is that they make concerted and organized efforts to legitimize political violence in pursuit of their own interests. And on those terms, I think that what is striking about the hearings for those of us in the atrocity prevention community is that America lights up the warning board for a number of risks of structural political instability and polarization that those of us who study this know very well are extraordinarily good predictors for increased risk of atrocity crimes within the approximate period. So the thing that I'm struck by, and I'll end with this, is that for all the interesting stuff that's happening in the United States government, both in the executive and the legislative branches, in trying to be better atrocity prevention actors globally, none of those, and this is a strong statement, none of those address domestic atrocity prevention, not one. And I think that this is a terrible missed opportunity. Before I hand it over to Karen, I think pillar one of R2P is the core pillar, that societies have a political, legal, and moral responsibility to address the sources of risk of atrocities domestically. And I would say that if we get serious about atrocity prevention in this country, it's great that we attempt to resume a sort of a leadership role globally, with compassion, with humility, with generosity, and with patience. We can't do that unless we acknowledge openly, and this goes back to the mirror metaphor that Adem opened us off with. We can't acknowledge, we can't do that unless we acknowledge openly and honestly that the atrocity risk in our own country has changed enormously over the past half decade. And unless and until we begin to address that in ways that we're not doing now, I don't think that we'll make much progress in the other areas either. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pensky. And the focus here at home, is very appropriate. Sad to say, from the brutality of manifest destiny to the fragility you speak of. And of course, we have mass killings, every day, pretty much. It's not always linked to politics, but it's certainly linked to social pathology of one kind or another. So the next speaker is someone that we all very much admire, former special advisor to the UN Secretary General on the responsibility to protect, as well as Leiden University lecturer in international relations. She was previously associate professor in international relations at the University of Cape Town and taught at several universities in South Africa. Between 2006 and 2007, she was the Secretary General of the United Nations Association of South Africa. And Karen, are you based in The Hague now? Is that right?
I am, yes. Yeah.
Yes.
It's about 10 minutes from Leiden, so not too far.
Yes. Well, we're looking forward to the decision on the 22nd about Burma and the Burmese military. Hopefully it will be the right decision. As we do stock taking and looking at the gaps and bottlenecks in genocide prevention or response to crisis. I imagine that there are some regional crises that don't get the same amount of attention. We all are aware of Ukraine to some extent, and as well we should be. But then there are many other horrible crises that are less known, and other aspects, gender and so forth, that may need more attention. So we would certainly value any reflections on your own service as special advisor and what you think needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and hello everyone. It's really a privilege for me to be here, and I want to start by thanking the organizers of today's panel, and also, of course, expressing my heartfelt condolences with the victims and the survivors of the Srebrenica genocide. I wanted to start off by saying that while the panel's focus is how to stop genocide, which is, of course, a huge question, I want to make it even bigger. And start by saying that what we're discussing today is really relevant not only to genocide, but also to other atrocity crimes, as well as to the plethora of human rights violations that precedes them. And I think this is an important point to make, as the term genocide is a very loaded one that can easily be dismissed as not being relevant to most cases, especially if it's interpreted in a narrow sense as applying only to large-scale killing like the Holocaust, Srebrenica, and Rwanda. And I think Max's comments just now about the potential risks in the US are a case in point, where you mentioned genocide to anyone in the US administration, and they're certainly not going to be looking inward, right? So this brings me to the first challenge I want to address. And what I want to do is just outline a few challenges based on my experiences at the UN. So some of them will be UN specific, but others will be broader. And so my whole idea is that, of course, challenges also present opportunities, because I think challenges allow us to kind of focus on where the problems are that we can hopefully work on. And so the first one relating to this definition, or this kind of stigma attached to genocide, perhaps, is that states are not always open to hearing about potential atrocity risks in their territories. And I think, we've all witnessed the defensive behavior, even the slightest mention of such risks elicits. And I'm not even going to start naming states because the list is quite a long one. And so efforts at early warning and prevention, including by my former office, are often misunderstood as declarations that atrocity crimes or genocide, are imminent. A second impediment, I think, to prevention work is the persistent resistance to distinguishing between atrocity prevention and other agendas, including conflict prevention and protection of civilians. And this is the case both when it comes to states, but also regional organizations and the UN. And while we all know that armed conflict is undoubtedly a driver of atrocity crimes and genocide, not all atrocities occur in situations of conflict. And so if we conflate atrocity prevention with conflict prevention, as is often done, this runs the risk of missing the specific risk factors that result in the commission of atrocity crimes. The third challenge is what I experienced very much when I was working at the UN, and this is the resistance from within the UN. And so atrocity or genocide prevention, including early warning, is viewed very much with skepticism. Specifically, there are, of course, worries that public expressions of concern by UN officials, including the special advisors on R2P and prevention of genocide, could somehow undermine other UN agendas, whether that be reaching a political solution to a crisis, mediating a ceasefire, securing or maintaining humanitarian access, etc. And related to that, of course, is the argument that the UN must remain neutral. Now, unfortunately, prioritizing impartiality often translates into maintaining good relations with governments that may be perpetrating mass atrocities against their own populations. And of course, because we are commemorating the genocide in Srebrenica today, I also just wanted to remind us that in his report on the fall of Srebrenica, the former Secretary General Annan actually criticized what he called the general tendency to assume that the parties were equally responsible for the transgressions that occurred, which eventually led to negotiations with those planning and executing atrocities. Now, while this deference to impartiality or neutrality is usually more tangible in situations of armed conflict, it of course also applies to situations of alleged atrocities in non-conflict situations in politically sensitive countries, and I think China being a prime example here. This tells us that one of the main reasons for the UN's failure to act in situations of concern is not what is sometimes said to be the problem, a lack of information or a lack of early warning. It's rather that prioritizing atrocity prevention is often regarded as an unwelcome interference in the organization's other business. Now, given my previous role, I wanted to also just mention some specific responsibility to protect related challenges. And we all know that despite now 17 years of discussion since the adoption of R2P by all UN member states in 2005, and a consistent emphasis on prevention, as Max has just outlined as well, by the special advisors, but also in the Secretary General's annual reports, many still only associate R2P with the UN Security Council and with military response. And this, of course, has the result that, as Max pointed out, prevention is then completely overlooked and not prioritized. Another major challenge, which Max also pointed to, is that R2P is still regarded by most states, if not all, as a foreign policy issue. And so this then, of course, means that there's very little focus on domestic implications, even though, as Max also highlighted, the first pillar of R2P has an explicit focus on an individual state's responsibility to protect its own population from atrocity crimes, and of course, importantly, to prevent their incitement. Now, I wanted to just add here that obviously this is important, right, to focus domestically, not just because you need to watch out for risk signs in your own community, but also when a state like the US then takes the stand at the UN and advocates for R2P and atrocity prevention, it doesn't have the credibility, right, amongst other states who it is then addressing. So just briefly to some opportunities, we know that atrocity crimes don't happen overnight and they are therefore preventable. I think that remains the biggest opportunity for us to focus on. And so the ideal, if we had to kind of say, well, what really needs to be done? Well, the ideal is, of course, for governments to invest in structural or upstream prevention, what Max also spoke about, by making sure that all those elements that we know increase risk are addressed long before they lead to violence. We know what the risk factors are, and we have tools to identify them. I should also say that this doesn't mean that the tools cannot be improved. So there's still work that needs to be done there. I think, for example, the fact that the gendered nature of atrocity crimes is not yet sufficiently recognized. Governments should, of course, also develop national action plans for atrocity prevention with a domestic focus so that there's a system in place for identifying risks and addressing them. And this, of course, while I say governments, this requires cooperation and coordination between multiple actors, including local and national governments, but also civil society, regional organizations, and the UN. Because we know that the best outcomes are achieved when atrocity prevention is a collaborative effort, but also when atrocity prevention is made a priority. And this, I think, is again a call to all of us to keep saying this, right? We have to insist that whatever issue is being discussed, whether it's conflict prevention, whether it's development, whether it's responding to a global pandemic like COVID-19, atrocity prevention must form an essential part of the discussion, including considerations of how certain actions could actually potentially exacerbate the risk of atrocity crimes being committed. Now, I just want to reiterate again, I focused very much on challenges, but I think we should see them as representing opportunities. And I think most importantly, we need to keep the pressure on governments, on regional organizations and on the UN to prioritize atrocity prevention and genocide prevention. And finally, there's unfortunately no simple solution to preventing genocide and other atrocity crimes. It requires recognition of the unique challenges associated with this important task and a willingness to admit that no society is without risk. And finally, it requires a concerted effort by multiple actors to address it in a context-sensitive manner. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Shall I call you Professor Smith or Special Advisor?
Just Karen, thank you.
Karen, thanks, Karen. So next speaker, last but certainly not least, is Gregory Stanton. And Gregory, Dr. Gregory Stanton is the founding president of Genocide Watch, the founder of the Cambodian Genocide Project, and the founder of the Alliance Against Genocide. He was president from 2007 to 2009 of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. Dr. Stanton served in the State Department in the 90s when he drafted the United Nations Security Council resolutions that created the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. He was legal advisor for RUK, the Ukrainian independence movement. Genocide Watch exists to predict, prevent, stop, and punish genocide and other forms of mass murder. Its purpose is to build an international movement to prevent and stop genocide. So welcome, Dr. Stanton. And I just wanted to flag perhaps for your attention. We heard from Karen about some of the cultural and structural reasons for resistance or inaction at the UN level, but also, as you know, the denial of genocide is part of the genocide. It's the stage of genocide, and we see that extending in many contexts. We also see what's happening in India, and you've been quite articulate on the huge risk currently in India developing, and I would be very interested in hearing your assessment of the current situation and how do we deal with this false neutrality that was discussed by Karen in the last presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you today. I have now been working on genocide for 40 years, and I will try to compress it into 7 minutes now. But basically, things haven't really changed much. In 1999, when we founded basically the modern anti-genocide movement, I looked around, there weren't any anti-genocide organizations, which amazed me. So we started Genocide Watch and the Alliance Against Genocide, and now there are many. And that's a very good thing. It's a positive thing. But at the time we started, I remember giving a speech in London in which I said there were two main reasons why we still had genocide. The world had not developed the international institutions needed to prevent it, and the world's leaders don't have the political will to stop it. And that hasn't changed. Now, we have a few more institutions, and Karen, in fact, was part of one of them. In that same year, 2000, Genocide Watch and the Alliance proposed the creation of the UN, the Office of the UN Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, which then was expanded to also include the responsibility to protect. And we lobbied with Kofi Annan and Donald Turk and the others, Ed Mortimer at the top levels of the UN. And finally, in 2004, of course, Kofi Annan did create the Office of the Special Advisor. And that was, I think, a positive step. I really appreciate the frankness that Karen showed when she said how many members of the UN don't even want to hear the word genocide. It's a sensitive word. It's a powerful word. In fact, that's why Raphael Lemkin created it. He knew that the regular words, atrocities, all the kinds of words other people might use for what was genocide weren't powerful enough to, in fact, elicit action. We actually tested that out. We did a study of this in 2007. I worked with an epidemiologist on this, and we looked and counted the number of times the words ethnic cleansing were used in the New York Times, in statements by human rights groups, in UN statements, and in law review articles. And then we also counted the number of times the word genocide was used in 4 crises. The first was Bosnia, the second was Rwanda, the third was Kosovo, and then the fourth was Darfur. And what we discovered was that as long as the term ethnic cleansing was used, a nice term invented by Slobodan Milosevic and the Serb propagandists, there would be no forceful action to stop it. And I mean, you can literally date it. As soon as the term, the dominant term, became genocide, then the world became open to using force to stop it. Now, I'm not claiming here that using force is the only way, obviously, to prevent genocide. I hope it can be prevented far earlier than when you need to use force. But what was striking was, within a month of the Srebrenica massacre, NATO met, decided they had to stop this, started bombing Belgrade. So Milosevic and the Serbs came to Dayton and the war was ended. We then had Kosovo, of course, which was another situation where Dave Sheffer, our war crimes ambassador, went up to the border, said that there were indicators of genocide, and he used the word, in other words. At that point, people said, really? They're only, this is, I say only. Now, wait a minute, when you hear the word only. There were only 10,000 people who had been killed so far. But that's because a lot of people forget that the Genocide Convention includes a lot more than killing. And they were doing the very things that are included in genocide, such as basically pushing people out of their homes. And so within a week, in fact, in that case of that, again, NATO was bombing Belgrade, and they, again, got a Serb surrender. That genocide was stopped. My son, by the way, later became a Peace Corps volunteer in Kosovo. Now, it's a wonderful and beautiful country, and I'm not claiming that all the conflicts in Kosovo, are solved. But what is striking about that was it was, and I'm not also claiming that the word genocide is some kind of magic word. It's not. It's not going to get you the kind of forceful intervention that may be needed. But it is a symbol, because people think with words. It's a symbolic way in which people express the gravity of the situation. And the other one was East Timor, where we had the word genocide used again. Australia and ASEAN intervened. I was here in Washington when we took a nun who had just been in East Timor, had watched a church be burned down around people. We took her to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And she told him what had happened, what she had seen with her own eyes. He broke down in tears. He called one of his lieutenants. He said, "Get me Wiranto on the phone now." I was there. He called, Wiranto was gotten on the phone. He said, "You must stop this now." And Indonesia backed down. That was another example of genocide prevention, but that was mainly using, frankly, the moral suasion and political power that was needed without having to actually engage in battles. So here we had 3 examples of genocide prevention. And we have others as well that have succeeded. Macedonia is another case. In that case, there was, in fact, a UN resolution. It sent in just a few peacekeepers to keep the Kosovo conflict from spilling over the borders. And fortunately, in that country, the leaders of both the Kosovars, the Albanians, I should say, and the Macedonians didn't want genocide. And we were able to get them together. They agreed that they didn't want genocide. And so they really prevented it in Macedonia. That's another case. Another case is Cote d'Ivoire. In that case, we saw the thing coming. We saw it. I had been a Peace Corps volunteer in Cote d'Ivoire. I also did my PhD research there. It was plain as day what was happening and what was going to come because of a military coup. An organization in the alliance, Prevention Genocide from Belgium, went in and made a film about it. Bodies had been spotted in the Banco forest. They made this film and interviewed a lot of people about the growing tensions in that country. They then took the film to the Ivorian TV station and got it shown, would you believe, on Ivorian TV. In other words, to wake up the country. And they also took it up to the Élysée in Paris. Now, a lot of you may know this, but France considers the Côte d'Ivoire sort of the jewel in its colonial crown, and they didn't want a genocide in Côte d'Ivoire. And they had a military base at Port Boué that was 4,000 French troops, including Air Force. They intervened. They made sure there was a cordon sanitaire down the middle of Côte d'Ivoire that kept the two sides, the north and the south in this case, from getting into a war. That was a case where actual, almost colonial, neo-colonial intervention helped prevent a genocide. And then we have another case in Kenya where it was national intervention by people in Kenya that prevented a genocide and is still preventing one. That was a case in which one of our member organizations, in fact, the Sentinel Project in Toronto, has a program, ongoing program, to basically counter hate speech. They monitor it very, very closely, and they have an army of volunteers to counter it every time it comes up. That kind of approach, where you have a real national effort, has also been a successful way to prevent genocide. Now, Karen mentioned, I think, very well that up to this point, at least, the UN has not usually succeeded in preventing genocide. And I want to talk about that just briefly. Why hasn't it? Well, first of all, the UN is an organization of nation states. It's not an organization of peoples like the beginning of its, the UN Charter says. It's an organization of nation states. And the nation states still mainly look out for their own national interests. The Perm 5 veto built into the Charter has paralyzed the Security Council in many, many cases. There are ways around it, as you know. The Uniting for Peace resolution empowers the General Assembly to act when there has been a use of a veto in the Security Council. And in fact, the meetings that have been going on about Ukraine in the UN General Assembly recently have been in the General Assembly because of application of the Uniting for Peace resolution. So it is not dead law. It is still usable. In fact, it's been used 13 times in the history of the UN, and we should be resurrecting it and using it a lot more. The basic problem here is nation states consider minorities to be within their domestic jurisdiction. That's why the Responsibility to Protect doctrine was developed. Unfortunately, it still hasn't become real international law. I wish it were. And I wish we had an international covenant that was really enforceable, or at least more enforceable. than what we have now. But it's basically right, because what it does is it puts sovereignty right side up again. The people who think that sovereignty comes down from the state down to the people have got it upside down. Sovereignty comes from the people and goes on up. If a government doesn't defend its own people, in fact, if it attacks its own people, it has lost its legitimacy, and we really need to, in fact, invoke the responsibility to protect. Another factor is that the UN still doesn't have a standing army under Articles 43 through 47. That was envisioned, but it has never been possible because of the great powers. So what we have instead is regional forces that can, in fact, intervene when needed. That's what has happened in the Economic Community of West African States, which stopped a couple genocides in Liberia and in Sierra Leone. I would mainly say this, that really the job is for us. We have got to build an international movement to make the institutional changes needed to really reform the UN system, to make it much more effective. I commend Karen on her wonderful service at the UN. And I think that we need to strengthen that office. We need to make that office more willing, in fact, to use the word genocide. Somewhere I read maybe a year or two ago, somebody issued a statement out of that office that only courts could declare that a genocide was underway. And I know where that came from, because when that resolution was passed to create that office, it specifically says they're not supposed to declare that a genocide is underway. That's too bad that that was put in the resolution. It should be corrected. But basically what we have, in other words, is still the situation of not enough institutions to prevent, and we still don't have enough of the political will needed to prevent. But I have not ever given up. I remember when I first made this talk way back in 2000 about what we need to do to prevent genocide, and made some of these suggestions. A couple of articles came out that just tried to take it apart. They said, look, that's never going to work. The world doesn't work that way. It was the realpolitik approach, saying, no, nation states are never going to put up with this. They're going to always pursue their own interests. And then there were the Marxists who really said, oh my gosh, no, are you kidding? Nation states acting on behalf of something bigger than their own economic interests? Anyway, I think nation states can act more on the interests of the whole human race than just on their own economic interests. And I believe, in fact, that we should still hope for that. And I don't think we should lose hope. We shouldn't, because we're working for a force that's way bigger than nation states. It's the same force that created the universe and every person.
MashaAllah, thank you, Dr. Stanton. And in fact, we have a question for you. I did want to say that members of struggling stateless communities impacted by genocide may be impatient with some of our discussion, but the question of language is crucial to policymaking. On the other hand, the U.S. in March, I think, U.S. Finally formally declared the Rohingya genocide a genocide, and I don't notice any particular change in policy since then, though correct me if I'm wrong. And with
That's right.
Ukraine, and with the Ukraine, I mean, do we have people began to use the word genocide quickly, and they were perceiving some kind of systematic brutality that seemed genocidal, but was that strategically a good idea or not? One could differ on this strategy.
Oh, I think it very clearly is genocide. I mean, when you have herbicide, which is the whole destruction of an urban area, it is the intentional destruction of part of a national group. That's called genocide in the Genocide Convention. It is very definitely genocide in Ukraine. The question and the use of the word, I think you should call a spade a spade.
Hmm.
If it meets the definition, use the word. And I was trying to explain to you why it's important to use the word, because it equips you with the forceful language you need to actually get leaders to do something about it. Now,
Yeah.
am not claiming, by the way, that we should be sending in massive numbers of troops and all this thing into Ukraine. I think that could result in nuclear war, and I hate that idea because nuclear war is by definition genocidal. But I don't think that we should ever be reticent about using the word genocide when it does apply. And
Good. Well argued. And we have a question from Rizwangul Nur, one of our Uyghur staff on just injustice for all. And I'd like to give her a chance to ask. And she wants to direct her question to you, Dr. Stanton, but also perhaps another speaker could also address the question afterwards. Please.
Sure.
Thank you so much for your speech. I am Rizwangul Nur-Muhammad. I am Uyghur, and my own brother, Mevlan, has been arbitrarily detained by the Chinese Communist Party since January 2017 as a one of the victims of these genocides that's going on. So my question today is that, first of all, let me just say that, in 2020, just 2 years ago, Genocide Watch joined other human rights groups urging the UN Human Rights Council to investigate the actions of the Chinese government that it is waging, genocide against the Uyghurs, and also urged to develop strategies to end this genocide. And recently we know that Michelle Bachelet also visited the place, but of course we know that it was not the visit that we were expecting, and actually it actually hurt the Uyghurs who have been suffering because of this genocide, inside and out. Even me, like as a member of Uyghur diaspora, we have been impacted by this genocide. For example, for me, like my basic rights to contact my family has been taken away. Mm-hmm. So my question for you, what we can ask UN to do? UN is not really doing anything to help Uyghurs. Like not only those who are directly impacted by the genocide in their land, but also those diaspora members. UN has not been like taking any project to help your diaspora. So what we can expect or request UN to do to help Uyghurs? What is your opinion on that? Thank you so much.
I think it really, unfortunately, goes back to the nature of the UN that I was speaking about earlier. Because the UN is still an organization of nation states, because China still has a veto in the UN Security Council, the UN Security Council basically powerless to do anything about the Uyghurs. It is genocide. In my view, very clearly it is genocide. All 5 of the acts of genocide listed in the Genocide Convention are being committed by the Chinese state against the Uyghurs. But then the question is, what can you do about it? I think economic pressure is certainly one thing that we should be doing. I don't think we should expect the UN to do that because, again, the UN Security Council is paralyzed. When you have a situation, though, of genocide, there are other ways the UN can act, even if it doesn't declare this is a genocide. It can use its many functional agencies, for instance, to bring relief to the people who are affected by the genocide. Think about what the UN is doing in Afghanistan right now. We have abandoned Afghanistan, and the Hazara people are at grave risk now of genocide again. But because UNICEF is there, because the World Food Program is there and so forth, we can get assistance into people in great need. I personally think that we have to encourage that and do everything we can to support the UN's actions there. So those are some of the things, but I wish we could do much, much more. I think restricting our, import of goods that are made in Xinjiang province, for instance, cotton that's picked, all the other things that are produced by forced slave labor. Those are good things. Those are important steps. But I wish I could suggest more, but making the world much more aware, I think, of the nature of the Chinese state. And one thing I want to emphasize here is a lot of people think there's a left-right spectrum. That is what philosophers, I especially appreciate that Max is here, philosophers would call a systematically misleading expression. It confuses people to think of the left and the right. And in fact, the political spectrum is way more complex than that. If anything, it's more like a circle in which one axis is attitude towards change and the other is attitude towards liberty. And the truth is, communists and Nazis are twin brothers. They're right next to each other in that diagram. And so what we really have is a form of Nazism that is being exerted on top of the Chinese people. And in fact, I would argue that we have a whole new movement towards Nazism in many other countries. And you mentioned India. That is one very clearly that is moving towards Nazism. We have it here in this country. The Trump people who tried to, in fact, stage a coup d'etat, the basic ideology that they have is racist, it's nationalist, it's sectarian. Does that sound Nazi? Well, it is Nazi. And I think we shouldn't lose track of that. We've got to be aware right here in the US too. So many of the world people are still under that kind of regime.
That's certainly the case. And Karen, I wanted to call on you because of your experience. What would you like to add to that response?
Thanks very much. I was just thinking about the fact, as Professor Stanton said, of course, the Security Council is deadlocked, right? Because China is a permanent member. But I think we also need to look beyond the Security Council. And so if we look to other parts of the UN, of course, it's not just the Security Council that can do something. So earlier, the General Assembly was mentioned under the Uniting for Peace resolution. And of course, that's not the only way. There's lots actually that falls within the powers of the General Assembly. So again, here, I think there's more that states can do. And so I think sometimes it's an easy excuse to say, oh, the Security Council is deadlocked, therefore the UN cannot do anything. Well, no, the General Assembly can still do something. The Secretariat, is not a member state organization. And yet we shouldn't forget that the Secretariat is also political. And what I mean by that is it responds to political pressure from states. And so I think that's important for activists, for people who are, in a position to put pressure on governments to say, well, we need to get our governments to put, equal pressure or more pressure on the Secretariat. And, I also include the Secretary General in that, to the pressure he's getting from states like China, because that's what he's responding to. But we also, of course, know that even those states like the US and others, will perhaps say that they condemn what is happening in China. When it comes to the crunch, we also know that there are political and economic interests at play, which means that they probably will not go as far as we would like them to. So here again, I think it's the role of civil society, and we've seen this in the past, right? Global social movements are able to do a lot. So there needs to be more momentum again around this question, to get governments to take this seriously and to take this up at the UN.
Oh, thank you. I wanted to call on Zoe Lee, our program associate, who, by the way, thanks again for helping to set up this panel. Your help has been really very much appreciated. So Zoe, the floor is yours.
No problem, Adam. And thank you all for this meeting. I guess I would first like to direct this question at Eve. Because it does concern media. In this day and age, media is extremely powerful. So I guess, how does social media compare and contrast with the propaganda of the past? Propaganda that fueled genocide used to be through newspapers and radios. But now that it is in social media, in various formats, how is it more or less dangerous? And I guess on that note, if anyone has any input on this, we know that, for example, Europe has more stringent regulation of social media. And do we know if there are any effects of that? Has it had a lower rate of crimes, of hate crimes compared to countries without those regulations?
Thank you. It's a really great question, and well, it's a very big question, but it's actually, parts of it are not that complicated. With print media and with radio before, obviously they played a huge role in the perpetuation of genocide. It's certainly in 1930s Germany is a great case of that. People were, got their information from the radio, and certain views could be espoused by it. But one of the things that makes digital media so different than print media is who has access to broadcasting ideas and who has access to hearing those ideas, and what's their range of options towards what they're listening to or reading. So back in the print media and radio stages, there were radio stations, there were newspapers, there are publishing houses, and they decide what's going to be published and what's not going to be published. They decide who's going to be broadcast and who's not. And then on the receiving end, there weren't a whole lot of radio stations and there weren't a whole lot of publications. So the kind of information that people are able to access was much more limited. Now you have, social media and also not just social media, but you also have the entire World Wide Web, and which includes all kinds of things of YouTube and it includes blogs, it includes websites and so forth, and they're all interlinked with each other. And so now people can, as we know from, that's been talked about in the news quite a lot, people can get their information from where they choose to get it. And they cannot even hear about other things that may be happening, or they might hear about it in some skewed, distorted way. So that really changes it. Plus, people at the same time can also broadcast themselves and say, within within certain limits, whatever they want, as long as it, escapes the monitors, which are gotten a little bit better, but that still a whole lot gets by. And there's always other channels that they can use to communicate. So that I would say would be the most significant differences. But I turn it over also to anyone else who wanted to answer the second part of that question. I don't want to take too much time.
Max, I wonder if you want to take a crack at that. I mean, besides the rumors and conspiracy theories in social media, I also wondered what your views are about media coverage of genocide, media coverage of genocide prevention, as well as of the UN in general.
Oh, well, I suppose in terms of the role of social media in general, and I think, Greg Stanton has encouraged us to call spades spades. So the Facebook in particular, by which I include, YouTube, Instagram, Snapchat. I mean, we all saw in the Tatmadaws attack on the Rohingya, in the lead up of that attack, 2017, the outsized role that Facebook and its associated companies played in making that coordinated attack possible. So your viewer, the audience members probably know about this. I think that one of the things that is really interesting to speculate on right now, and this goes back to some of the comments that Eve made, is how can a corporation, a corporation that is based in the United States, be made accountable for what is, by any reasonable definition, materially aiding and abetting the commission of atrocity crimes, not just genocide, but also crimes against humanity as well. And I think that there's a certain rabbit hole that we can go down here, which has to do with the status of indemnification or the Facebook's being shielded from civil damages and civil liabilities by Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of the United States. But law is, and I think that, you know, I talk about this a lot, but law is a verb, not a noun. I mean, law changes and adapts, and I think the powers that be at Facebook, I think, are vividly aware that the protection that particular piece of federal legislation affords them is wearing thin. There is an enormous class action lawsuit by Rohingya persons and groups that is now being ongoing against Facebook. Whether that has any sort of material outcome, I doubt it, but it's that lapping wave action against what is obviously a dumb piece of legislation or a dumb, unreasonable use of that legislation to shield an enormous American-based corporation from what should be a tsunami of class action and individual lawsuits. It will be very interesting. I mean, the way that social media corporations can be held accountable in the law, but also in the court of public opinion, we know very little about this right now. It's very new days. I mean, these kinds of things always chase after the developments of the technology and the use of that technology itself. This is normal with technology. But one of the things I would love to see over the next few years is top executives at Facebook having a meeting that we'll never learn about, where they say, we have got to stop this. We're going to be sued until the end of time unless we stop, drop this sort of pseudo-libertarian idea that all we do is provide an open, free, and unmediated, unmoderated forum for people to express ideas, and start participating in a much broader effort to try to de-weaponize social media. Did that answer the question? I'm sorry.
I think it really answered the question. I thank Max for that. And by the way, Genocide Watch is looking at the world as a place where there are a lot of jurisdictions where Facebook can be sued. It's not just the US, of course. And the US may have the Communications Decency Act, Section 230, that sort of immunizes it. Of course, Tom Malinowski wants to amend that. He's a congressman now. And there are many others who want to amend it as well. But how about some of the other countries that have been really deeply affected? Bangladesh, France, India. They don't have laws to protect Facebook. And so remember, we're in a multifaceted legal system in the world. And so I can tell you just, you know, it's all, what we do is, it has to be confidential in the sense that the lawyers that will be found and that will be bringing suit against Facebook in those jurisdictions, you know, will be found. And we are intending, in fact, to sue them until the end of time.
Well, thank you. All right, I realize the time. This is a really very important and interesting discussion, but I do think we have to wrap it up. And I guess this is just an ongoing discussion because we all deal with this in our work and our lives. I wanted to ask if Sister Hena Zuberi would like to say something before we wrap up. And that lawsuit that was just referred to, one of our staff members actually is part of that lawsuit, the one that targets Facebook for damages. But Sister Hena, would you like to wind us up?
Thank you so much, Adem, for hosting this. And I'm just overwhelmed from the moment the Imam started speaking and sharing that video to this point. You know, you do this work on a daily basis and you try to extract your own self from just the fact that these are atrocities happening to real human beings. They're not just numbers. They're people with families, and just to see all of it come together like that, it really just, and it brings our work and the importance of the work to the forefront every time. And I know all of you, this is hard work to do. It's hard to be witnesses to these horrific crimes. And so I thank all of you from the bottom of my heart. And at this point, I can, as a person who is seeing people from her own community being targeted, and there is a genocide happening on the way in India, and it's all of this, the digital, the use of digital spaces to attack, Facebook being used, so many of the laws that are being used to perpetuate those injustices. And I could hear those threads, and I'm like trying to say, oh my God, like, no, don't let this happen there too. We can stop it. We have the power to stop it right now. And what can we do because that would impact 250 million people in the subcontinent. Just the amount of people, like, what will that do to the subcontinent? It just terrifies me. So I just wanted to thank you all from the bottom of my heart. And I do hope each one of you is taking care of your own mental health and taking breaks and really just not thinking about this 24/7, because this work can consume you. But thank you for being here.
Thank you. And thank you. It was very good discussion. And I hope that some of the people who are watching this will want to join this work. We need you. We need to prevent genocide. We're facing climate disaster. We're facing a lot of things, but they do intersect. A lot of these crises do intersect. And so if, as the Peace Corps used to say, or someone used to say, if you're not part of it, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem, something like that, right? So I think we all are trying to be part of the solution and not the problem. So I leave it at that. Thank you all, and take care of yourselves.